Hey guys! Welcome to the Haunting Hour Nightly, where you can enjoy scary short stories, perfect for bedtime. Feel free to like and subscribe for more haunting horrors. Let's get into it, starting with
The Room That Watches. It started with a strange listing on a rental website. Room available, $200/month. No questions asked. No overnight guests. The price was too good to pass up. I didn't have much money, and the idea of having my own space, even if it was small, felt like a blessing. The landlord was peculiar. An older man with sunken eyes and a voice that cracked like dry wood. "You'll hear things," he said bluntly as he handed me the keys. "Ignore them, and keep the curtains closed at night." I laughed nervously, thinking it was just old man paranoia. But when I stepped into the room, my smile faded. It was bare bones, a bed, a single chair, and a small desk by a window with heavy, faded curtains. The air felt stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The walls were lined with faint scratches, as though someone had dragged their nails across the plaster over and over again. Still, I convinced myself it was fine. Cheap rent was worth a little weirdness. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked, got into bed, and fell asleep almost immediately. But the second night, I heard it. A faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the wall opposite my bed. I sat up, heart pounding, and stared into the darkness. The sound stopped. I got up, feeling foolish, and knocked on the wall. Nothing. Shrugging it off, I went back to bed. But then it started again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder, more insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. I pulled the curtains aside, thinking maybe the noise was coming from outside. Big mistake. The moment the curtains opened, the room grew colder, bone-chillingly cold. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint whispering, a sound so low I couldn't make out the words. And then I saw it. A face. It wasn't outside the window. It was in the window, pressed against the glass from the inside. Its features were warped, like melted wax, but its eyes, they were sharp, black voids that stared straight through me. I screamed and yanked the curtains shut, stumbling back onto the bed. The whispering stopped immediately. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I told the landlord I wanted out. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I told you to keep the curtains closed," he said. "You've let it in now." "What does that mean?" I demanded, but he only shook his head and walked away. That night, the tapping started again. I kept the curtains closed this time, but it didn't matter. The whispers came, louder now, filling the room with an unbearable static. My lights flickered, and I swear I could see shadows moving along the edges of the walls, darting just out of sight. I thought about leaving, but the door wouldn't open. The handle wouldn't turn, and the hinges seemed fused to the frame. Then, the scratching started. It was coming from the floor, just under the bed. Slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was clawing its way out. I didn't dare look under the bed. Instead, I climbed onto the desk, hugging my knees to my chest as the scratching grew louder. And then, silence. For one awful moment, I thought it was over. But then the whispering returned, clearer this time. A single phrase repeated over and over. "Look at me. Look at me. Look at me." The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, layered, like a chorus of different pitches all speaking at once. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voice wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from inside my head. The next thing I remember is waking up on the floor. The room was empty, the air still and quiet. But my reflection in the window wasn't mine. It stared back at me, grinning.
The forgotten signal. When the power went out in my apartment complex, I barely noticed. It was a stormy evening, and the wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and tearing at the trees. I lit a few candles, pulled a blanket around my shoulders, and settled onto the couch with my phone. Then the Wi-Fi cut out. Annoyed but unsurprised, I decided to wait it out. With the storm raging outside, there wasn't much else to do. But as the minutes ticked by, the silence inside grew oppressive. I could hear the faint creak of the building settling, the occasional gust of wind slamming against the windows. And then something else. A faint hum. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it, but as I sat there in the flickering candlelight, the sound grew louder. It was coming from my radio. I hadn't used it in years, but there it was, glowing faintly in the corner of the room. A faint green light pulsed on its old display, and the hum rose and fell, almost like static but more melodic. Curious, I approached and turned the knob. The moment my fingers brushed the dial, the hum stopped, replaced by a voice. "Help me." I froze. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by static, but it was unmistakable. "Please, someone. Can you hear me?" I leaned closer, my heart pounding. "Hello? Who is this?" The radio crackled, and the voice returned, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, trembling with desperation. "I'm trapped. Please, help me." "Trapped where?" I asked, my voice shaking. The response was drowned in static, but then a word came through clearly. "Basement." I stood there, staring at the radio, my mind racing. The building didn't have a basement. It was an old complex, built on concrete foundations, and I'd lived there long enough to know every corner of it. "This has to be a prank," I muttered, stepping back from the radio. The voice returned, louder now. "Please don't leave me. It's coming back. It's—" The transmission cut off, replaced by an ear-splitting screech that sent me stumbling backward. The radio's light flared, then died, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on its flashlight, and swept the beam across the room. The radio sat silent and dark, as if it had never turned on in the first place. And then, from somewhere deep in the building, I heard it. A low, grinding sound, like metal on stone. I told myself it was the wind, or maybe the storm rattling the pipes, but something about the noise was wrong. It was deliberate, rhythmic, as though something was being dragged. Against my better judgment, I opened my door and stepped into the hallway. It was pitch black, the emergency lights apparently dead. My phone's beam barely pierced the darkness as I crept down the hall, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The noise grew louder. It was coming from the stairwell at the end of the hall. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but the voice from the radio echoed in my mind. "Help me." I pushed the stairwell door open, wincing as it creaked loudly. The grinding sound was louder here, echoing up from below. There shouldn't have been a below. I shone my flashlight down the stairwell and froze. There was a door at the bottom. A heavy, rusted door that definitely hadn't been there before. My breath caught as the grinding sound stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, like the air itself had gone still. And then, the door at the bottom of the stairs opened. I didn't see what was on the other side. My flashlight flickered violently, and all I caught was a glimpse of something long and pale sliding out of view. A chill ran down my spine as the voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the radio. It was behind me. "Help me." I spun around, my flashlight shaking, but the hallway was empty. Empty, except for a faint trail of wet, black marks leading from my apartment door to the stairwell. The grinding sound resumed, louder and faster now, and I ran. I don't remember getting back into my apartment. I don't remember locking the door or collapsing against it, struggling to catch my breath. But I do remember the silence that followed. The oppressive, unnatural silence that lingered long after the storm had passed. The radio never turned on again. A week later, I moved out. The landlord didn't ask why, but as I was leaving, I saw the look in his eyes. He knew. I've tried to forget that night, to convince myself it was a bad dream brought on by stress or an overactive imagination. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it again. That faint, grinding sound, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. And I know it's still waiting.
The Silent Ones. When I inherited my grandmother's house, I didn't feel grief, I felt relief. She had always been a strange, cold woman, and her passing meant the end of tense family visits to her isolated home in the woods. The house itself was old and creaky, built generations ago by her ancestors. Still, I figured I could sell it after sorting through her things. A quick visit and it would be over. I arrived on a gray afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds. The house looked worse than I remembered, its paint was peeling, the windows clouded with grime, and the surrounding forest seemed to press closer than before. I shook off my unease and stepped inside. The interior smelled of dust and decay, like the house had been rotting from the inside out. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, the threadbare rugs, the faded photographs on the walls, the grandfather clock in the corner that hadn't ticked in decades. As I started sorting through her belongings, I noticed something odd. There were mirrors in every room, but they weren't hanging on the walls, they were all covered with thick black cloths and propped against the furniture or stacked in corners. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered something my grandmother used to say, "Never let them see you." I'd always thought it was just one of her eccentricities, a strange mantra muttered under her breath. But now, standing in her empty house, it felt less like a quirk and more like a warning. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had uncovered dozens of mirrors, all hidden like shameful secrets. The house grew darker, quieter, the wind outside howling through the trees. I decided to stay the night. I was too tired to drive back, and I figured I could finish the job in the morning. But as I lay in the old guest bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with faint sounds, a soft rustling, like fabric brushing against wood. Then came the creaks, floorboards groaning as though someone, or something, was moving through the house. I told myself it was just the old structure settling, but the noises didn't stop. They grew closer. At one point, I was certain I heard breathing, low, shallow, and coming from just outside the door. I stayed frozen under the covers, barely daring to breathe. Minutes stretched into hours, and eventually, the house fell silent. I told myself it was my imagination and drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, the air in the room felt wrong. Heavy. Oppressive. And then I saw it. The mirror in the corner. I didn't remember uncovering that one. The black cloth that had been draped over it was now on the floor, crumpled like a discarded coat. I tried to ignore it, but as I moved around the room, I couldn't help glancing at the glass. It was too dark to see my reflection clearly, but something about the mirror felt off. As I leaned closer, I realized why. The reflection wasn't mine. It looked like me, but it wasn't. Its eyes were too wide, its mouth curled into a faint, unnatural smile. And it was moving. I stepped back in horror, but the figure in the mirror didn't. It stayed pressed against the glass, watching me with unblinking eyes. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I turned, heart pounding, and saw nothing but the empty room. When I looked back at the mirror, the reflection was gone. I grabbed my bag and bolted, determined to leave the house and never return. But as I ran down the hall, I saw more mirrors, all uncovered now. Each one showed the same thing, me, but not me. The reflection stared, some whispering soundless words, others grinning with malicious intent. I reached the front door and yanked it open, only to find myself staring into another mirror. This one was massive, its ornate frame gleaming like polished bone. And in it, I saw them. The silent ones. They were pale, featureless figures, standing just behind me in the reflection. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only empty air. But in the mirror, they moved closer. I screamed, throwing my bag at the glass. It shattered with an ear-splitting crash, shards raining down around me. When I looked back at the doorway, the mirror was gone. I didn't stop to question it. I ran to my car, started the engine, and sped away without looking back. But as I drove, something caught my eye. In the rearview mirror, I saw them again, sitting silently in the back seat, their blank faces turned toward me. I smashed the mirror with my fist, cracking the glass, but it was too late. Now, they follow me everywhere. I see them in every reflection, in windows, puddles, even the glint of my own shadow on a polished floor. They're always there, watching, waiting. And every time I look, they're closer.
The first time I heard about the Bone Orchard, I thought it was just a local ghost story. A patch of forest on the outskirts of my hometown, whispered about in hushed tones by old-timers at the diner. They said it wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. According to the legend, anyone who went into the Bone Orchard alone would hear the whispers. If you listened too long, you wouldn't come back out. I didn't believe it. Of course I didn't. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But when my best friend Tom dared me to spend one night there, I couldn't back down. We were 20, cocky, and stupid. I packed a flashlight, some snacks, and a pocket knife. Tom dropped me off at the edge of the forest with a smirk. "See you in the morning," he said, but there was something in his eyes, something that looked a little too close to pity. The forest was dead silent as I walked in. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of dead leaves under my boots. It wasn't long before I saw them. The trees. They were ancient and twisted, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. Their bark was pale, almost white, with jagged lines running down their trunks like scars. I couldn't explain it, but they felt wrong. I set up camp in a small clearing, rolling out my sleeping bag near a flat rock. The flashlight's beam seemed too weak, swallowed by the darkness pressing in from all sides. As the hours dragged on, I started to feel it, a heaviness in the air, like the forest itself was breathing. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then came the whispers. Soft at first, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of leaves. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more distinct. "Why are you here?" I froze, heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they multiplied, overlapping like a chorus of voices just beyond the edge of the light. "Leave! Leave! You don't belong here!" The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, something pale darting between the trees. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my pride wouldn't let me. I grabbed my pocket knife, gripping it tightly as I stood. "This isn't funny," I shouted. "Who's out there?" Silence. Then, a low, groaning creak. It wasn't the sound of a tree swaying in the wind. It was deeper, guttural, like something massive shifting its weight. And then I saw it. Something was emerging from the forest, its shape barely visible in the faint light. It was tall, impossibly thin, its body blending with the pale bark of the trees. It moved with an unnatural grace, its long limbs folding and unfolding like a spider's. And its face. It didn't have one. Just a smooth, featureless surface where its eyes and mouth should have been. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my hands. It hit the ground and spun, casting wild beams of light across the clearing. The thing stepped closer, its elongated arms reaching out toward me. That's when I noticed the roots. They were everywhere, writhing like snakes beneath the dead leaves. As I watched in horror, they began to coil around my ankles, pulling me toward the trees. I screamed, slashing at the roots with my knife. They recoiled for a moment, but more replaced them, stronger and faster. The whispers were deafening now. "Stay! Stay with us! Feed the forest!" Desperate, I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the creature. For a moment, it hesitated, its smooth face tilting as if confused. I didn't wait to find out why. I yanked my legs free and ran, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that clearing. The forest seemed endless. The pale trees loomed over me, their branches twisting together like a cage. The whispers followed, growing louder with every step. And then I saw it, the edge of the forest. The faint glow of streetlights beyond the trees. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, and burst out onto the road just as a car screeched to a stop. It was Tom. He jumped out, shouting my name, but I couldn't speak. I collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air. When I finally looked back, the forest was still. The pale trees stood like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching toward me as if in farewell. I never went back to the Bone Orchard. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, and I know the forest is waiting.
The longest hour. It was supposed to be an easy gig, 1 hour of babysitting. Mrs. Klein, my neighbor, had an emergency and needed someone to watch her son, Max. I wasn't close to the family, but I'd seen Max a few times. He was a quiet, pale kid, maybe 8 years old, with dark circles under his eyes. Mrs. Klein offered me $50 for the hour, and I figured it'd be the easiest money I'd ever make. When I arrived, Mrs. Klein was flustered, already halfway out the door. "Thank you so much," she said, shoving a list into my hand. "Max is already asleep upstairs. Just keep an ear out. And no matter what," she paused, gripping my arm, "don't go into the basement." I laughed nervously. "Okay. No basement. Got it." She didn't laugh back. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. Without another word, she left, the door slamming behind her. The house was eerily quiet. I stood in the entryway for a moment, looking over the list she'd given me. It was simple enough. Don't wake Max. No visitors. Don't go into the basement. That last one made me roll my eyes. Maybe they were renovating or something. Still, the way she'd said it bothered me. I settled onto the couch with my phone and a bag of chips. The first 20 minutes passed without incident. Then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it. A faint thud. I froze, staring up at the ceiling. It sounded like it came from upstairs, where Max was supposed to be sleeping. "Max?" I called, but there was no response. Another thud, louder this time. I grabbed my phone and crept upstairs, my heart pounding. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from a crack under Max's door. I pushed it open slowly. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, and there was no sign of Max. "Max?" I called again, louder this time. From somewhere below, I heard a faint giggle. I whipped around, my heart leaping into my throat. The sound had come from the direction of the basement door. "No way," I muttered. "Nope." I went back downstairs, my legs trembling. The basement door was slightly ajar, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into the dark. "Max?" I called again, gripping the banister. "This isn't funny." Another giggle, this one softer, like it was coming from deeper below. I hesitated. Mrs. Klein's warning echoed in my mind, "Don't go into the basement." But Max was down there. I couldn't just leave him. Taking a deep breath, I descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to press in around me. The faint light from my phone barely illuminated the concrete walls. At the bottom, I found a small, cluttered space filled with boxes and old furniture. And in the center of the room, there was Max. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, his back to me. "Max," I said, relief flooding through me. "What are you doing down here? You scared me half to death." He didn't respond. "Max?" I stepped closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder. Before I could, he turned around. It wasn't Max. It looked like him, but his eyes were wrong, too large, too black, and they shimmered like wet glass. His mouth stretched into a grin far too wide for his face, showing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. "Do you want to play?" it asked, its voice layered with something deep and guttural. I stumbled back, my phone slipping from my hand. The light hit the floor, casting long shadows across the room. The thing that wasn't Max began to crawl toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I said, "Do you want to play?" It repeated, louder this time. I screamed and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost polite, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. "Let me out," the thing whispered from the other side. "I'm Max, don't you want to help me?" I backed away, grabbing my phone and keys. As I ran out of the house, I glanced back one last time. Through the small window in the basement door, I saw it staring up at me, its black eyes glittering in the dark. I never told Mrs. Klein what happened. She never called me again, and I didn't ask why. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that voice. "Do you want to play?" And I always wake up screaming.
If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying tales. And let me know in the comments, what's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? Maybe your story will inspire the next video. Until next time, stay safe. And remember, some doors are better left closed. Sweet dreams.